paint a bit of a picture for you. And I'd like you to imagine what I'm describing. It might be a little bit shocking. It might not be what you expect. But I'd like you to picture a prison cell. It's cold. It's dark. There's no sunlight. There's concrete everywhere. There's steel bars. And this is what I'd like you to imagine, a prison cell that is dark, gloomy, dirty. And there's a man, and his name is Bob. And he is someone that goes to the prison regularly. He visits with prisoners. He sees their hardness. He sees some of the difficult things that they've done and their struggles. And as he's walking by, he notices this one prison cell, and it's different than the rest. Not necessarily in the decor or anything like that, but there's a prisoner laying on the floor. He's curled up in the fetal position. His knees drawn up. His eyes are open, but he has a blank stare as if he's looking through whatever he's looking at, just completely giving up. There's even a cockroach scurrying by, and the man doesn't flinch. He's just laying there, empty. And as Bob saw this prisoner, something was welling up inside him, something that he wasn't expecting. He had an empathy for him. And he started to wonder, he said, this prisoner is here for a good reason. They've done something wrong. Should I have an empathy for someone like this? Doesn't he have to serve what he has done? He has to be in prison for the wrongs that he has done. He is just serving his sentence. I don't know if I should have empathy for him. But as he began to think about it, he noticed that this prisoner was different than the rest. There wasn't a hardness. There wasn't an edge. There was just an emptiness, a being forgotten. And deep down, he knew he had to reach out to this young man. And so he started to befriend him. And he found out that this young man's name was Rusty. Rusty didn't feel like he was worth anything. He had done some horrible things. He'd committed murder. He was where he should be in prison, but he'd also given up. He was very broken. Bob also found out that Rusty had a horrible childhood. His father abused him regularly, physically, emotionally, verbally. And it was from this that he started to have this vision of who he was. And so this is what he carried over into every relationship that he had going forward. Whether that be with his schoolhood friends, whether it be with his teachers, whether it be with his future girlfriends, and so on. So much so that this path of destruction and harm was what he knew, and that's what eventually led him to being in prison, to lying on the floor, empty. He began to think, did Dad have it right? Am I worthless? Is there nothing good within me? And it was in those moments that he would lie on the floor because he just had given up. There wasn't anything more for him to continue to do. He was misunderstood. Yeah, he did many bad things, but that wasn't necessarily who he thought he was. And as he began to share with Bob, he started to just realize that maybe there's just something different. Maybe there is some hope. And I have to admit that if we're looking back on our own lives, there are times where I think that we can all say that we've been misunderstood, where someone didn't just quite see who we were. Can't say it might be as drastic as what Rusty has been through. But I do imagine that we have had that feeling. It reminds me of a time when I was actually in Springside, and that's not too far from here. It's just east of here by Yorkton. My Baba used to have a farm out there, but she moved into Springside once my grandpa passed away. And so I'd go there during the summer, and I'd bring my rollerblades. I was probably about 12 or so, and I would rollerblade around town. It's only a town, I think, 300 or 400, so it's not that big. And one day while I was rollerblading, I started to get picked on by some of the local kids. They started to say, hey, nice rollerblades. Can I try? Can I have them? And they kept taunting me and bugging me. And what was my reaction? I got to get out of here. I'm done. I just I don't know. So I just left. And it never really resolved in anything difficult, but I was getting upset And later that night, I was upset with myself, as if I should have said something different. So I kept playing it over and over and over again in my head, saying, well, next time if this happens, this is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to do. I'll show them. I think when we're misunderstood, we sometimes do that. We play things over again and again in our minds, saying, next time, this is what I'm going to do. And we make these plans, we make these strategies to say, this is how it's going to be different going forward. You know, we read in Ecclesiastes about Solomon. This is a man who had everything. He had wisdom beyond measure. He had wealth beyond measure. He also had way more wives than he should have. And in the midst of this, he acknowledges that everything is meaningless. There is nothing new under the sun. He has the ability to pursue whatever he wants. And yet he himself is still seeking something greater. I'd like to suggest that one of the things he was looking for was to be understood. You might have gone through that, looking, needing someone to understand you, and then having relationships with those closest to you, knowing that you're trying to have them help you figure out what's going on, whether that be your parent, your child, your wife, your husband, your grandparent, your best friend, whomever it might be. You're just wanting to have someone understand where you're coming from, that maybe, just maybe, you're trying to do something different this time, that even though you might have done something wrong before, this time you're trying to make it up. You're trying to make amends. And that is where I believe we find our main character that we're going to be looking at this morning. If you'd like to open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 42, verses 36 to 38. Now we're going to be talking about Reuben. Reuben, yes, the eldest son of Jacob. I'd like to paint a picture here of what is happening within these three verses. Jacob's sons have just arrived back from being in Egypt, getting some grain, because why? There is a famine, and Egypt is the only place where they can find any food. And yet they come back not quite the same way that they left. You see, Simeon stayed behind because the Egyptian ruler that they didn't know was actually their brother Joseph, who they had sold into slavery. They didn't know that he was there, and Joseph requested that Simeon stay behind. And then even more, he also asked that the next time you need to come back for grain, bring your younger brother, because I don't trust you. How do I know that you're not spies? The Egyptians were very wary of trading at that time. And so this is the message that they're sending back to Jacob. Jacob, who is still grieving the loss of Joseph, because as far as he knows, he's dead. This is a family that has a lot going on. There's deception. There are issues in relationship. And they are at the brink, right at the moment where we pick up in verse 36. They've just told Jacob that this is what needs to happen, and this is his reply. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me." Then Reuben said to his father, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow." It's just 3 short verses, but there is a lot packed within them. There's a lot of family history and drama and pain. As mentioned, Jacob is still grieving the loss of Joseph, and he's never fully recovered. He's clung to Benjamin so tightly that he's even willing to potentially jeopardize the livelihood of the rest of the family so that Benjamin doesn't have to go with him, even though he may be fine if he goes to Egypt. But the risk is too great for Jacob. We also know that Jacob, in his grief, hasn't necessarily always looked after his sons as well. They've been neglected to an extent. They've also done some bad things, these sons of Jacob's. We know that Levi and Simeon massacred the Shechemites. And we also know that Reuben himself made a very poor choice. And in the horrible dynamics that happened, he ended up sleeping with one of his father's wives. He did bear the consequence for that and lost his inheritance. But this is the family drama that is going on within this. So these 3 verses, jam-packed with issues. This is a family in crisis. And I'd like to suggest that a crisis does not make a man. A crisis shows you what the man is made of. So why don't we look into what Reuben was made of? To do that, I think it's important to understand the dynamics that he was brought into when he was born. Yes, he is the oldest son of Jacob. He's also the first son of Leah. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. One he really wanted to marry, but he was tricked into marrying the other by his uncle. So even from the get-go, before the very moment that Reuben is born, this is the dynamic that he's born into. His father clearly has favorites when it comes to his wives. He truly loves Rachel. And this is evident in the fact that because when he is born, the very name that his mother chooses to give him, Reuben, it means he sees. God has seen. And it sounds like the Hebrew word for God has seen my misery. It means see a son. So this is what he was born into. The naming of Leah's sons continues in that manner until Judah, when she eventually praises God. But throughout the entire time, she's hoping that this son that she gives Jacob will remedy the issues in her marriage, that maybe now, maybe just now, Jacob will genuinely see her. He will love her because she is the one who has given him a legacy that will continue with his sons, an inheritor. And yet that isn't what happens. Reuben grew up each and every day, I would suggest, knowing that his father loved another woman more than his mother. When Joseph came along, he knew that his father loved one of his sons more than he loved him. These are the dynamics that he would have grown up in. There would have been microbattles that would happen, because you can imagine that if you have a family of 12 boys, there's going to be some battles. You can also imagine that if there's 4 wives, there's also going to be some other battles that happen. We read of one in Genesis chapter 30 that involves Reuben. And why I suggest that he was involved in some of these micro battles is because it's recorded right here in Scripture. In verse 14, he is the one who gathers the mandrakes for his mother Leah so that she can be more fertile. She uses them to lure eventually and trade with her sister Rachel for a night with Jacob. This is what Reuben would have known. I can think back to my own life in different dynamics of wanting to be understood, and from hearing from some of my friends growing up that there's sometimes different dynamics that you might have with your parents. I'd like to suggest that there's a real turmoil and conflict within Reuben going on as he grew up. On the one hand, he loved his father. But on the other hand, I'd like to suggest that he had some feelings that weren't so loving. You might even suggest that at times he was just really upset with him. I can't say he hated him, but sometimes when you're misunderstood repeatedly, some of your feelings eventually become stronger and stronger and stronger. On the one hand, he admired him. On the other hand, he could have been disgusted by him and the way he was treated. He needed his attention. He needed his father's approval and affection. And then there was all those times where he likely wanted nothing to do with him. And so, in Genesis chapter 35, when Rachel dies, Jacob's beloved Rachel, what does Reuben do? He ends up sleeping with Bilhah, which is incestuous, wrong, immoral, adulterous, unethical, and just not appropriate in any way, shape, or form. But within the culture of the time, he was the individual who was going to inherit his father's estate. He was, in some ways, proclaiming, I am going to now take the inheritance with this action. Doesn't make it right. He suffered, as he should, the consequences of his actions. He lost his inheritance. He lost that trust from his father, and even likely from some of his brothers as well. And yet you can also imagine that within that action, that maybe there was another message behind it. A rebellion, yes, but a message suggesting, I don't need you anymore, Dad. I'm done with this. I'm going to be the head of the family. I'll do things better than you ever did. I'm going to look after the family. I'll look after my brothers. I won't have favorites anymore. All you do is love Rachel more, and you're so upset that you've forgotten about my mom. You love Joseph so much. Well, that's enough. I've had it, Dad. You don't even see me, do you? And it doesn't matter anymore. It just doesn't. We're done. And yet this is a very sad situation. And as we go back within this passage in Genesis 42, we find that Reuben is the one who speaks up after his father. Jacob says, you have deprived me of my children. He is the one who steps up and says, okay, I'm going to do something different now. He is the one who ends up offering his own sons, which is really something that I don't imagine Jacob would have had an appetite for. But such is the devotion and the desire within Reuben, I would suggest, that he wants to make up for what he has done wrong. We know that he feels guilt over what happened to Joseph. He was the one who spoke up and said, no, we aren't going to kill him. No, let's put him in a pit instead. Because he had plans to go back and rescue him after. But he wasn't strong enough. He wasn't someone who had enough integrity in that situation to say, no, we can't do this. This would be wrong against our father. It's wrong against our brother. He didn't protect him outright before he was sold into slavery. And so he is the one who would have had to deliver this news to his father, along with his brothers. He would have seen the grief and the guilt eating away at him over time and time and time, so that when it came up again, he was the one who offered, I will make this right. And yet when you look at the wording in verse 36, it says, you have deprived me of my children. You is a funny word. You can mean the singular and you can mean the plural. In this case, it actually means the plural. Jacob was talking to everybody. But it is Reuben who feels appropriate that he needs to respond because he feels some guilt. I think back to, I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, but I would say probably within about 3 or 4 years. I used to live in Edmonton, and I can't remember where I was going, but I was late. So what happens when you're running late and you need to be there at a certain time when you're driving? You tend to speed up. And so I was doing that. I found that I had a clear spot as I went off an off-ramp onto a short freeway, and I sped up. And sure enough, there's a speed trap. And so I see the police officer. He goes like this. And so what do? Yep, I'm guilty. So I pull over. I get my license, I get my registration, and I wait. And I waited. And I waited. I think it was about 5 or 6 minutes before I eventually had a tap on the glass, and I rolled down the window, and the officer says, it wasn't you that I was pulling over. It was the guy behind you. You're free to go. I was speeding. I was going about 15 or 20 kilometers over the speed limit. I was guilty. He had pointed at me and said, you. And so I pulled over. I think that's something that Reuben is feeling in this moment a little bit. He is feeling some guilt over what has happened. So when his father says you, he thinks of it as you, him, what he has done. And so that's why he makes such a reply. He makes such an offer of even his own 2 sons, which was done with all sincerity and genuineness. But again, just missing the mark. We know this because in verse 38, we find Jacob's reply. My son will not go down there with you. I'll stop right there. Again, this is a plural you. But if you've just made this offer, this grand gesture to do something greater than what you did before, to make amends for your mistakes, to fix what is going wrong, do you think that Reuben would have really heard that it was a collective you? Or would he have felt rejection himself to an extent? We don't know fully, but I would like to suggest that I believe, looking at the dynamics of everything here, that there would be some of those feelings for sure. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. Again, he is the only one left. There are how many other sons of Jacob? But Benjamin is the only one in Jacob's eyes that is really being put at attention right now. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. They were just not connecting. Have you ever heard of the term like a 747? No? Well, I now know it, but I think I was in about junior high or so, and one of my friends said, man, like a 747. And it's ironic because I didn't know what he was talking about. So what it ends up meaning is it's like a plane going over your head, like a 747. So not only did I not know what he was saying in the first time, when he said like a 747, that too went over my head. With what is going on within this passage, Jacob and Reuben might as well be 30,000 miles apart in terms of what they're trying to get across to each other. There's a lot of dysfunction. There's a lot of misunderstanding between them. And Reuben, in all his earnesty, is trying to fix things. He's trying to make things right. And yet, he is still misunderstood. You know, Reuben is a secondary character within the Joseph narrative. But it does seem that conflict kind of follows him around. I can't say he's exactly a magnet for conflict. But he is someone that is used to dealing with issues. There's always been these battles, I think, that he's gone through time and time again. And it makes you wonder, would anything have been different for him? Would anything have been different if he had been the favorite son? He might have gotten the coat of many colors. He might have had all his father's attention, but he would have likely also then had the opposite with his brothers, just like Joseph did. Would he have been the one who was sold into slavery? Would he have been the one who had to feel all the anguish, the separation from family? Joseph had so much pain and anguish that when he eventually told his brothers who he was, and he revealed that he was actually Joseph, he cried so loud and wailed with such anguish that the Egyptians heard of it, and they told Pharaoh. So deep was the emotion within him. So even if you're the favorite, it doesn't mean that the grass is greener. It just means that it is different. If Reuben had been the favorite son, it doesn't mean that he would have fully been understood either. He might have had a greater understanding within his father, but his brothers might not have understood him. But what if Jacob had agreed to this offer? What if Jacob had said, wow, thank you. Yes, okay, go and get grain for your family and make sure that Benjamin comes back. I'm going to trust you. Do you really think that when Reuben had eventually gone back, there is a strong likelihood, we don't have any of this, by the way, in the Bible, but just reasoning things out logically, it would have likely happened that Joseph would have eventually told him, I am Joseph, as well. And do you really think Jacob would have remembered this grand gesture that Reuben had done when he found out that Joseph was actually alive? There would be a likelihood that he would have forgotten it. So even if his father had actually said, yes, go ahead and do it, he probably would have still been misunderstood. He wouldn't have experienced that reconnection with his father that he had been longing for. And so I ask you this. Can the broken ever heal the broken? Can the broken ever understand the broken? If we look at Jacob and his life, was he ever the favorite son of his father? No. That was Esau. He grew up knowing that his father loved Esau more than him. You go back another generation with Isaac and Abraham and Ishmael. There's obviously conflicts and issues there because those families can't even live together. They have to be apart. And then when you look at Jacob's grief, he was so upset that he has clung to Benjamin all these years. And he is still grieving the loss of Joseph, that he has neglected his own sons as well. Jacob is broken when it comes to our relationships with people around us. Sometimes we expect things from them. We have things that we need them to fix. We have things that we need them to understand within us. And yet, sometimes they miss the mark. And I think part of the reason for that is because they too are broken. And maybe their focus just isn't there. They don't know how to fix these issues. They don't know how to understand you. If you'd like to open your Bibles with me to Psalms 147, verse 3, the Bible gives us an answer to these situations of brokenness within relationships, to being misunderstood within relationships. Psalms 147, verse 3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. It's a short verse, but it is filled with a wonderful promise. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. We need a relationship with Jesus Christ. He is the one who can understand us. He is the one who is able to understand our brokenness and to actually put the pieces back together. There are different types of brokenness. In this passage of what we're looking at relationships of brokenness, being understood properly within relationships. There's also brokenness that is related to mental health. Mental health is a different dynamic, one where there can be other supports through medical professionals, doctors, psychologists, counselors, etc. In this passage, we're talking about brokenness when it comes to relationships. And there is no one greater at fixing relationships than Jesus Christ. He is the one who is able to figure things out and to sort through what we actually need. Now, you might be wondering what this is. This isn't a mistake or a typo within the slides. It's actually called a magic eye test. I remember first seeing one of these, I'm going to say sometime in the 90s. It used to be in the Sunday comics in the local paper. And what you would end up doing is there's an image there. You don't have to try it on this one, it's a little bit far away. But I'm just going to tell you what you would end up doing. You would hold the image about 3 inches from your face. You'd let your eyes get blurry, don't focus, and it's as if you're looking right through the picture. And then you would slowly move it back, keeping your eyes unfocused, and an image would start to take shape. I believe this is what Jesus does with each and every one of us. He is able to see through all the mismatch, what looks like there's nothing there that makes a cohesive picture. But Christ is able to see and understand us so that when He puts everything in so that a picture takes shape. You know, I have had personal experiences where I have not necessarily let Christ heal some of my brokenness. I put those expectations on other people. And usually what ends up happening when I put too much expectation on what someone else is able to give, it just usually causes distance between us. I end up getting hurt, and it just continues over and over again in a vicious cycle. In looking back at Rusty, that prisoner on death row, he ended up talking to Bob more and more, and Bob shared Bible studies with him. He introduced who Jesus was to him. And over time, the very demeanor of Rusty changed. He began to have a peace about him because he had accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior. He had found someone who could understand him. He was still in prison. He was going to face the consequences of his actions, as he should. But he was no longer alone. He had hope. He was understood on a level that he had been yearning for his entire life. You know, there's times in our lives when we expect someone else to fix what is broken within us. And I can acknowledge this because I've known Jesus all my life. I've been an Adventist my entire life. And yet, I don't think I understood that even though I had a relationship with God, I wasn't looking for Him. I wasn't looking to Jesus to fix those issues within my own heart as much as I am now. Sometimes when we expect someone else to fix something for us, they're not always able to. They don't have the necessary parts. If you look at fixing a car, if you don't have the right tools, if you don't have the right replacement parts, you can't fix it. With Christ, He is someone that has the right parts. And what I'd like to suggest, and this is what I've experienced within my own life, that if I am in need of having, say, 50% from someone else to fix or understand me, maybe they're only able to give 20%. But Christ carries through the rest of it. He takes the deepest parts. He somehow, magically, in terms of how he weaves everything together, it's a mystery. He is someone that is able to put it all together so that when I go to that person, they're actually able to give me what I'm looking for because I've now been able to put my roots where they should be, in a relationship with Jesus in a deeper level. Rather than continually going in a circle, I'd like to suggest that you let Jesus heal your brokenness. Let him bind up your wounds of relationship issues. Seek him first, even if someone else has hurt you repeatedly. Allow him to be at the very center of your issues, of your pain. And then see how he is able to then help your relationship. Whoever that may be, whether it be your spouse, your father, your mother, your child, whomever it may be, your best friend. Give him the opportunity to heal what is broken within you. In a moment here, we're going to be singing our closing song, hymn number 99, God Will Take Care of You. One of the lines within this passage of the hymn really struck me. I'm just going to repeat it here. All you may need, he will provide. God will take care of you. You know, as we sing this song, if the Holy Spirit has been nudging you, if he has been working on your heart to open up to God just a little bit more, to surrender more to Christ than you have before, about your own brokenness, about your need to be understood, I pray that as you sing, you surrender that. You surrender that to God, and that you see where he will lead from here. Allow him to maintain his promise of healing your brokenheartedness and binding up your wounds.